This clip is going to give you an overview of trench warfare. This diagram shows us a typical trench system on the Western Front. So there's a few things we need to keep in mind when we're talking about trench systems, and that is that the trench systems along the Western Front were very complicated. So the British frontline trenches were between 2 and 3 metres deep and 1.5 metres wide. So either wood or corrugated iron strengthened the sides. Huge rolls of barbed wire up to 30 metres wide protected them. And behind the frontline trench were support trenches and communication trenches. So we can see this if we have a look on here. So this is our frontline trench. This is our support trench. And down here, our communication trench. So along our communication trench, we would have had supplies, food, troops, all those sort of things would have been moved. So the support trenches, these support trenches here, they had in them latrines, kitchens, stores, and then behind the trench system were the artillery posts here. So we would have our ammunition dumps, and we'd have our field hospitals and all that sort of stuff all the way back here. So the German trenches over on this side, they were actually much deeper than the British ones. Some of them were actually have been said to be 15 metres deep. And they had underground sick bays and sleeping quarters for the troops. They actually also had electric lights often in there, and they had piped water and good ventilation. So the conditions over in the German trenches were much, much better than they were over here in the Allied trenches. So the other important thing to consider here is, of course, this little bit here, which is the area between the two trenches, which was known as no man's land. So it was usually about 500 metres wide. Sometimes, though, it could be as narrow as 50 metres. There was a bit of a system to trench warfare. A major attack on enemy lines would begin with an artillery barrage that usually lasted for days. So the purpose of this was to unnerve the enemy, but also to destroy the barbed wire that was in front of the trenches. Often, however, the shells were duds, or they fell short, or they only were successful in actually churning up no man's land. And sometimes the enemy withdrew from the frontline trench, and they returned once the gunfire had stopped. After the bombardment, the soldiers fixed bayonets onto their rifles, and they went over the top. So they went over the top of the trench and into no man's land to attack the enemy trenches. They usually walked straight into a hail of machine gun fire and were mown down in their hundreds. Casualties were really high, and gains of land were actually really minimal. So stretcher bearers fetched wounded soldiers from no man's land. They took them into their regimental aid post where they were given first aid, and then they were taken to the casualty clearing station behind the lines where they were operated on their injuries if they were serious. As you can see, this diagram here is actually a cross-section of a trench. So those things I explained to you before, you can actually see the reinforced trench, and all of these things that are explained, the barbed wire that the bombing would try to get rid of. Life in the trenches was actually pretty gruesome. Soldiers usually spent 16 days on trench duty, 8 in the frontline trenches, 4 in reserve, and 4 in rest camp. Even when they weren't under attack, the men had to put up with a lot, and they had to be tough to survive the really awful conditions. So in this picture that you see here, we have British soldiers using a pump to drain a frontline trench, and this was in January in 1917. So the reason they were having to drain these trenches was that in the summer the trenches were really hot and really dusty, but it was much, much worse in winter. So heavy rain caused the trenches to flood, and the men often had to stand knee deep in liquid mud. So in frosty weather, the duck boards, which we saw in that picture on the last page, they were paths built of wooden slats that ran along the trenches. They would freeze over, and so it was even difficult just to stand up. And you also need to think about the fact that many of the Empire soldiers had never seen snow or felt so cold. They'd never been that cold. They were issued with woolen underpants to keep warm. Many men suffered from trench foot when their feet swelled up due to standing in that water that these men here are trying to pump out for long periods of time. And this was so painful that it made them actually scream with agony. Many soldiers also suffered from shell shock, which is a kind of a nervous breakdown brought on by the fear and the stress and the conditions that they were living in. And some soldiers were actually unable to even utter a word when they were suffering from shell shock, or they would tremble and shake. So it was impossible for these men to get clean properly. So there were a lot of skin diseases. Their clothes became full of body lice, causing their skin to be constantly itchy. Men would actually take off their jackets and they'd run a lit cigarette around the seams in order to burn off the eggs of the lice. And this gave them a little bit of relief, but the lice would soon come back. So the lice also caused trench fever, which was a kind of a flu. And the trenches were also infested with rats, some of which were as large as small cats. They fed off all the scraps of the food and the rotting flesh of the dead bodies. And the men, apparently, when you read a lot of the descriptions, they hated the rats almost as much as they hated the shelling. You can see in this image here some of the German soldiers who had caught a lot of rats. So the food at the Western Front was not very appetising. So men lived on tinned corned beef, which was bully beef, biscuits, bread and cheese. They were also given tins of a stew, which they ate either hot or cold. Sometimes they had bacon and something called Tommy Tickler's jam, which was tinned jam made of plums and apples. And the drinking water was supplied in petrol cans, and it was chlorinated to kill the germs, so as you can imagine, it did not taste very good at all. The daily routine in the Allied trenches began at dawn with what was called the Daily Hate, which was giving the enemy a volley of rifle and machine gun fire. The men had to then clean their guns, ready for inspection, and after breakfast they had a heap of jobs that they had to do. So they had to repair duck boards and replace them. They had to fill the sandbags, and the rest of the day was spent playing cards, reading, writing letters home, trying to get some sleep in the dugouts. And then at dusk, food and water supplies were carried up to the front along the communication trenches. At any one time, there was about 1/3 of the men on sentry duty, and the sentry duty was actually really quite hard work. It was necessary to concentrate for 2 hours at a time. So at night time, there was a lot of activity. Some repaired the barbed wire, others raided the enemy trenches. Parties of men crawled over no man's land and threw grenades into the enemy trench. At other times, soldiers crouched in listening posts, trying to find out what the enemy was doing. So the relief of the trench units also took place at night time. The new soldiers had to wade through the wet, winding communication trenches that we saw on the other page, laden down with rolls of barbed wire, shovels, picks and corrugated iron. And then the soldiers going off trench duty, they could look forward to having a proper meal and some leisure time, or maybe a hot bath in the local town. I think the best way for us to get an understanding of what it was like in the trenches is the words of the soldiers themselves. There's one quote here that comes from a World War One soldier remembering the smell of the trenches years and years later. And he said, The familiar trench smell still haunts my nostrils, made up of stagnant mud, latrine buckets, chloride of lime, unburied bodies, rotten sandbags, stale human sweat, and fumes of cordite.